What's up, everyone? Michael Heath with Get Automating. About 6 months ago, gas station down the road implements Tap Pay. Really exciting. Go to use Tap Pay, access denied. Got to stand around there being mocked, teased by the gas pump. It's got to reset, takes a couple minutes. Sometimes the methods for authentication just don't work. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be exploring the authentication methods when we make API calls within Power Automate. Instead of making me pay for my gas like a caveman, just put a big old sticker over it. Say it's broken.
Get automating, enhancing humans daily.
All right, so far in this series, we've used APIs that are completely open, no authentication required. But more often than not, and for good reasons, APIs that you're going to use are going to require an authentication. So the methods we're going to explore today are basic authentication, token bearer authentication, and OAuth authentication. Let's dig in. All right, so starting out in the Power Automate cloud, make.powerautomate.com. Come over here to create, get our instant cloud flow going, name it up, Manual will trigger these flows. All right, so the first thing we're going to explore is basic authentication. If you recall, we're going to come down here to our HTTP connector, add that in, and then in the URI, we're going to pop in this dummy JSON API. The method's still going to be get, but we're going to come down here to advanced parameters and show all. The authentication type we're going to explore is basic. Now, basic authentication is the simplest form of authentication. Usually, username and password are username and a token. So for this one, we're going to drop in the username and we're going to drop in the password. And we're going to go ahead and save it out, test the flow manually. Couple things we want to look at here in the input is we notice that the password is sanitized here. Now there's a few more options you can go through to further obscure this data by going into settings here, and you can turn on secure inputs and outputs. Let's go back to our flow here and add a new authentication method. Going to be looking at bearer token authentication. This time I'm going to be hitting the Lord of the Rings API. We're going to be doing the get method. This particular one, if we look at the documentation, we can see here that the request for authorization needs to be in the following format. And this follows the traditional bearer token authentication. So we're going to come over here for this one. We're going to leave the authentication type to none, and we're going to add some information in the headers here. So for this one, it's authorization and the bearer and the API key. All right, let's go ahead and run that. And we've come back with our data yet again with our body sanitized authorization key. All right, and for the last one here, let's go ahead and explore OAuth. So OAuth is this framework that allows limited access to applications. It works by delegating access to the service that's being requested instead of passing on the user's credentials. So if we come back over here, we're actually going to use Graph API to illustrate what OAuth looks like. So we've got our call there. This particular one's grabbing group data, and our method is still going to be get. Now, when we come down here, we're going to choose that authentication type as Active Directory OAuth. We're going to be asked for a certain set of information. Now, these are all going to be different depending on the API call you're making. We're going to be exploring what graph looks like here. So authority is referring to the authentication server URL. So for Graph API, it's going to be the login.windows.net. So the audience refers to what is the intended recipient of the token that's being passed. Again, for Graph API, we're going to look at graph.microsoft.com. And so we're left with tenant, client ID, credential type in this particular instance, which is secret, and then the secret itself. To give you a summary of how this works, in Azure, you're registering that app. You're going to assign it permissions, giving it permissions to access this piece of data, in this case, groups. So we're giving it access, read, write, whatever that may be. And then we're protecting that information by applying a secret. And that's what Power Automate is asking for here. And so to make the video a little more enjoyable, I've dropped those in as variables using the compose action. So we're going to just pipe these through, save it out, give it a test, and we've got our status code 200. Keep in mind that every API is a little bit different. So it really does bode well in the end to look through the documentation to understand what is being asked and how it's being asked to ensure that you're constructing your API call correctly. All right, so there you have it. We've explored 3 methodologies for authentication within an API HTTP call in Power Automate: basic authentication, bearer token authentication, and OAuth authentication hitting the Graph API endpoint. Remember that API construction can vary from API to API, so it really is important to dig into the documentation on how those calls are going to be constructed for that individual endpoint. But with a little bit of effort, authentication methods can be easier than paying for gas. Until next time, get automating.